Welcome to this episode of Level with Emily Reese, featuring a conversation with composer Wilson Brown about the music in Let's Revolution. Wilson is part of an audio studio called Antfood, and there were a handful of composers that did the music collaboratively for Let's Revolution. Let's Revolution is like a roguelite, Minecraft-esque puzzler, and the soundtrack is really chill, and so this team of composers worked together to find just the right vibe, and I think they did. It's really chill, and I really love the soundtrack. Join us on Discord. That link is down in the show notes. If you can watch some extra videos of ours, that would help us out. We're really close to monetization and need to just get our watch time up just a little bit more. So if you could help us with that, that'd be tremendously great. And if you can support us financially on Patreon, check us out there, patreon.com/level. Here's Wilson talking about Let's Revolution.
Well, the game's called Let's Revolution. It just came out on Steam less than a week ago, I think. And it's been, it's been doing really well so far. So we're really excited about the, from playtesting and demos to now, it's been really well received, and it's fun for us to start to see, some little comments pop up about the music. But I guess we had started last fall. I was looking at this because I pulled up a sort of a treatment deck that we had made of how we wanted to approach the music, in preparation to chatting with you. And our longtime collaborators, friends, are animation motion graphics company called Buck. We've explored a number of forays into gaming together, developed a number of sort of proof of concept vertical slice ideas, and this was the first one that we brought to market together. But they'd approached us and had already done a bit of the mechanics, but certainly all of like the concept art and story. And we work very closely with them across a number of different disciplines. But this is something we're all really passionate about, and it was a fun. I don't even know how to like get into this story, but I think, the concept is this sort of goofy, irreverent take on, I guess a disconnect between the elite and the not elite. And, so there's this king who's named the King of B-Bomb. I actually somehow ended up being his voice. So now I have all these like social media marketing things where I'm just really being a total asshole. Yes. We're building like an AI voice of him as well to nice. Sort of just spout out, horrible things. But there are these different regions. Have you played the game or just listened to the soundtrack so far?
Just listened and watched a bunch on YouTube. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really fun. It's sort of roguelite minesweeper type game. I personally wasn't really familiar with these, this sort of genre. So it was fun to dive into and explore, what are the sort of standards and the framework that we're playing within that, and what can we bring that's novel to it? And we can get into some specifics, but I think for me, the most exciting aspect, and my team, I run, a team of composers and, creators here in our New York and Amsterdam studio. We worked on this game together. But was really like building a world for a pretty simple, puzzle logic-based game that we could kind of build this more fantastical world, that there are these different regions, there's shops that, are characters that come from different lands in the realm. And so it's really like a very simplified take on, building an entire world that culminates in this, almost, I don't know if the game designer would like this, but it almost reminds me of like Hunger Games. How there's like the capital where it's, all of these sort of out of touch sycophants of the king, and it's derived from kind of the culture of the regions that they govern, I guess, but that nobody likes them. And so it's just, a quick kind of simple story that we could tell musically by setting a tone for these, fantastical made up ancient cultures that are all unique and different, and then kind of culminate into the capital that, where the king lives. And, no spoilers, but your goal is to, revolt and I suppose eventually kill the king.
At least unseat him at the very, at the very
yeah.
least. No, I mean, the game itself, like, it seems amazing. It would be right up my alley, especially like the roguelike kind of, I love that. Love the color palette it's just an adorable game. And so it seems like maybe you said that a lot of that was already ready by the time you started working on it, like you were seeing gameplay, or were you getting concept art and things like that?
Yeah, it was actually it was concept art. And I mean, I think we're all really excited about where this can go from here. There were originally like sort of 6 different lands that were scoped. We built out 4, and depending on the success may build a bit more, but there was concept art, characters, and sort of prose descriptions of the history of these proud people. So there's the Floxians are this sort of transgendered warrior desert folk. The Cymbidium is this like sort of ancient, almost elven looking forest kingdom. There's a one called Saffron that are sort of these high priests that live up in the clouds. And there are a few others, and then there are these shops that have characters that come from some of the other lands. And so, yeah, I mean, to answer your question more directly, there was a concept and a story for each of these, which for us as composers was fantastic.
Yeah.
Because we were able to think about, okay, it's fantasy, right? And we can sort of base it in, some aspect of reality, but we tried to look through the lens of what is the sort of sonic palette, the harmonic structure, the sense of space and grandeur or, sparseness in each of these regions. And we could pull some things from, gaming, from media, film, from just our imaginations that are sort of tropes of those places as inspiration, but also try to think about was a framework that could hold all this whole world together.
Yeah, and so where did you go then in terms of the sonic palette? And I know based off of my listenings, which incidentally did happen the first time I listened to the soundtrack, I hadn't looked up anything at all about the game, which is kind of one of my favorite things to do, because then you're like, oh, why trumpets? Because I'm a trumpet player and I love trumpet all day. I want trumpet all day. So I'm like, oh, why? And then you read into it, you're like, oh, probably because there's a king, And so it's fun to like draw those musical conclusions. I don't know, but I loved the horns that popped in. I loved choir at a certain point. There's like choral voices in the background. It's just a really fun sonic place. So talk to me about that.
Yeah. Well, I love that you picked up on that. I listened to a few of your episodes, and I loved the one with the "Deliver Me the Moon, Deliver Me Mars." And
God, I love
the other
those
day,
games.
Sunday's fantastic.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there are a couple aspects. Like the trumpets, we wanted to pay homage and also do a bit of tongue-in-cheek parody with this idea of like the regal fanfare, right? So that was an obvious tool or mechanism musically that we could play with. One of my colleagues here, Linton, is a great jazz trumpet player, and so sort of brought him in, and we started doing the fanfares. So in gameplay, you need to sort of uncover the tiles, defeat some energies, use some of your skills that you've acquired to figure out how you're going to navigate it. But in all of the early levels, you're not really battling the king. You just sort of find him, and then he scoots away on his little hovercraft egg car kind of thing. And so there's always the fanfare that represent in the early levels that represents the king. And then we started to use that almost more as like a little, sonic cue that's triggered in Fmod at a certain point in gameplay. But then as the game evolves, we start to weave in, actual trumpet melodies and lines into the fabric of the compositions that culminates in the last level, which is that B-bomb. I think it's called the King's Clutch on Spotify, but it's they're all sort of same key, same tempo. They all kind of ebb and flow and work together, and then we like ramp it up for that last sequence. It's last 3 levels or so, And so that, the trumpet becomes a voice there. And we're really trying to play, in a very, sort of, call and response or like variations on a theme technique of like that there are these different forces at play. There are different instruments that represent the different cultures, and they're all sort of intertwining and playing against each other musically as the game evolves. And so one of my favorite elements is I can isolate and send you some audio files if it's helpful, but there's this little chromatic thing that happens in that King's Clutch track that plays over the last few levels.
The trumpet, right?
Yeah, and then it opens up into this bigger, melodic theme that we're using throughout in a variety of different instrumentation. And so that was, I think we try to do that in all of our work, but just sort of the pace and the world that was built for Let's Revolution was a really fun way of playing with, like, there are these forces that are opposed to each other, and whether they're working together, whether one's oppressing the other, whether they're actively fighting in our imagination, there are all of these different instruments that in a musical way have to sort of push and pull, and sometimes they're in unison, sometimes they're sort of playing counter to each other. And so that was just a fun technique for what we do in terms of composition, arrangement, and production, to try to give an allusion to what we imagine is happening in action behind the scenes of just bouncing around the tiles.
Yeah. And I love too that there is always kind of like a little wink in the eye. There is humor in this music, which you obviously see when you're playing the game, which I didn't, but you can see it's just funny, which is fun.
Yeah, and I think it couples with the illustration, and just sort of the visual style and world building, that there's like, we're taking a more, an important and a heavy theme, but applying a very irreverent, silly, goofy take on it. And even like the visuals of the king himself is like this big kind of puppet head. I've always assumed that there's like a tiny little, Wizard of Oz or some kind of, insecure man behind this like bravado mask, but so I think in all aspects of it, it's supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be, silly.
Yeah. Love that. So I also loved, and I think it's probably in there a lot more than I noticed it maybe, but a lot of like mouth percussion. And there's one track in particular where you hear it, obviously, like mouth clicks or whatever. So talk to me about that.
Sure. Yeah. I think, there's a ton of stuff in this. I can talk a little bit about, our process as we get into it, but we had a number of different composers working on this. You'd mentioned before the choirs and the sort of vocal performance, and that's for that sort of ethereal cloud, priest world.
Yeah.
So I think, with vocal performance in terms of like mouth pops, clicks, and there are a few tracks, there's also a lot of, hand percussion, wooden percussion for that sort of woodland realm called cymbidium. But here, is it helpful to like maybe jump to like what the concept of how we picked this kind of palette of sounds?
Sure.
And I think there were two potentially contradictory ideas. One, we wanted to bring a lot of real acoustic human performance to it, and that could be in the mouth percussion, the trumpet lines. There's a lot of recorded string, cello, and violins, violas. And at the same time, our initial concept was to build upon the palette. Like, we were obsessed with Sound Blaster Live. In 1998, there was this PCI card that came out, and all of a sudden you went from having, synthesized sound cards in games to having sample-based sound cards. And, by today's standards, it's very low fidelity, poorly sampled, not a ton of range and variation and dynamics. But for us, we found, that so charming. And so we looked into, how can we bring an element of that, and using, those sort of sound banks from Sound Blaster, but also going a little bit back further in time from the late 90s to the early 90s, and looking at like I have a Kurzweil K2000 behind me, if you know what that is. Spencer, one of the other guys, had a D50. And some early, kind of wave station, early, wavetable and sample based synthesizers. And so the world was to sort of blend like early digital with human performance acoustic instrumentation. And so I think, well, I'm not sure like everybody, cares about this or picks up on it, but if anybody is, they certainly listen to your podcast. But we tried to build like a unique palette that wouldn't stand out and it didn't feel off-putting or off, brand or media. But it blended some things together in a novel and interesting way. And so we're sort of looking back at an earlier period of time, but thinking about how we can combine that. And so that's a bigger answer to your question. But I think looking at the vocal treatment, that was just one element of trying to bring some human performance in it and really do something that, doesn't shy away from the tradition of MIDI sequencing, but it imbues a little bit more life in it, right? We weren't trying to make a pure, just straight up jazz ensemble and like keep it all off the grid. We were trying to sort of, blend the best of both worlds, but maybe push a little bit away from the high gloss, like big MIDI, libraries that are used in a lot of like, bigger sort of AAA and even III kind of games. So we wanted to do something that felt tasteful, bespoke, unique, but but maybe looked a little bit more backwards than forwards.
Yeah, sure. There's one track in particular that kind of hit me nostalgically because of that sound. I think that like, of the era, like sampley kind of sound. Aquila maybe, because there's just all these old-timey piano samples in there kind of mashed together, which was really fun. And it especially reminded me of those early years of people doing that, which I think is what you're going for, Yeah. That was cool.
I love that. Yeah. I love that you noticed that and it feels it, because I think that, we certainly have real pianos around the studio that we love to record and play. We also, have nice, modern sampled libraries of elegant 9-foot Bosendorfers that we couldn't actually afford to put in the studio here. But at the same time, I think there's such charm in that sort of 90s, 2000s sampled. Obviously we all know it from kind of Euro dance tracks, but there's a real fun limitation, really, I think is what a lot of this is about. And I know we sort of blew up the score in a way, but it was we did have a concept that we wanted to adhere to across all of the cues.
Sure. Tell me a little bit more then about Antfood and where you are, because you're all over the world, really, but where you are, where your studio is. Just tell me a little bit about that.
Sure, yeah. So Antfood, we're a music and sound design studio. We, broadly believe that we solve problems as they pertain to all things audio. We work in a lot of different spaces. We do linear composition for commercial and film. We do a lot of large scale physical installations and experiences like the Empire State Building and big, light and sound sculptures. We do sonic branding work. And we really love, creative audio innovation projects, game engine projects, nonlinear composition, thinking about spatial sound, how we can work, with our craft in mediums that are less maybe rigid than, the traditional tape music start and stop. And so we've done a lot of, game engine work. Sometimes that can be for experience and events. Sometimes it's for games. We do a lot of work in the AR, VR space and have done a lot of gaming in that. This was our first, I'll say it's our first published, sort of more, PC based game. And I think one thing about the studio, I'm here in New York. We have an office in Sao Paulo, Brazil, Amsterdam, Netherlands, and Los Angeles. And the New York and Amsterdam teams worked really closely on this. But I think one thing that's unique about the studio is that we work collaboratively. So often, the seed of the idea or maybe a harmonic outline or sort of a first pass was done by one composer, and then we invite somebody else to come in and say, hey, can you, add something to this? What do you think about this? You want to chop it up and rearrange? And so we have an iterative process where we're all sort of collaborating and putting ideas together. And I think and everybody was really excited to work on this. We had, arguably more people than we needed to or could have, because there was such an energy and excitement. But I think we really had sort of 4 core composers, myself included, working on it. And then we had a team of another, 5 or 6 people that were contributing, melodic ideas or percussion, or were performing an instrument. Yeah. One of my team members here, who is in the studio, but I couldn't drag him in to talk to you, unfortunately, Spencer Casey, he had done all of we did this one in Fmod for middleware. It's Unity, but he had done all of the sort of programming or Fmod design, which was really fun to have that team member in-house and be able to bounce ideas around about, some of the tracks are a bit more linear. Like in gameplay, I think we always sort of have a base layer, and then as you encounter enemies, as you sort of get closer to, achieving the goal, we're adding additional layers, often sort of, big tribal drums and things that take this sort of chill ambient, bed and give a bit more, drama and tension to it. And then, there's a couple different states too, where, if you can like reach all clear, or you can find the king, which are both, successes in getting out of the level, but they'll sort of evolve into different, aspects of the music, and you get sort of you take all the drama away once all of your enemies are dead. We talked a little bit about the fanfare there. Yeah. So I think, in addition to just thinking about there are these compositions and then, recordings, versions we made for the Spotify playlist, but there, the in game, there's a lot more sort of diversity and, aleatoric combinations that can happen of combining the elements, especially in some of the shops. We got one of our executive producers in the Amsterdam studio who wasn't working. She voiced a few of the voices for some of the characters. Okay. But she wasn't really working on the project, but she got an email out of the blue from someone like the first 24 hours that the game was launched. And it was like, love the game. I played it for like 9 hours. And I've listened to the soundtrack like however many times, and it's really great. But my favorite song from the game is not on Spotify. And it was like one of the shops for Chovy, which is one of the characters. Okay. But and it's a beautiful composition, but I think we just sort of overlooked that. We also are going to press a vinyl. That's the working plan. So that's why it's like 38 minutes instead of hours. But the Chovy cue, and it's such a nice thing to just get an email like that out of the blue. But then our marketing coordinator was like, oh, cool. Well, we'll just like put up another EP for her on Spotify with that and a couple of the other cues that we left out. But that one in particular, we didn't include it on the linear, vinyl and Spotify pressing because it is a more sort of generative piece in Fmod that kind of, just ebbs and flows. So we didn't have like a linear bounce of what it is. And every time you go into that shop, it plays a little differently. The plus side is we can take what is often a 10 to 40 second experience in that shop, and we can just let it run and make a 3-minute track for Spotify.
Exactly. Make everyone happy. Yeah, I mean, someone's responsible for the Cuica in the Woodlands. Yeah, that's my favorite thing in the world. I just love it made me laugh.
Yeah, I wanted to I should have brought that in. That's always a hit. So we and I'm biased too because worked on composing that track. I don't know what it's called on Spotify. Maybe the Woodlords, something like that.
Yeah,
that was a really fun one. The world is this sort of beautiful, ancient, proud culture that lives in a somewhat like Lord of the Rings, elven Rivendell kind of kingdom, and half that and like half like, was it Robbins or Swiss Family Robinson, where they live like in the trees. So we wanted to have this sort of wooden, and they're like technologically sophisticated, but I assume everything's made out of wood and leaves and dirt, something rather than metal and plastic. That was I love that composition, both in sort of the rhythmic mechanical aspect of it, but then once we start taking that harmonic, journey with all the borrowed harmonies. I started my career working in Brazil. We have an office there. I have a big affinity for Brazilian instruments and music. We always have whenever anybody's going from, New York to Brazil and back, we try to bring back a kind of basket of percussion instruments. But we've had a number of cuicas over the years. Now we have one of the big profissional, ones. I think that's just like I don't have too much of a story behind it other than we love the instrument, and it's such a sort of haunting and calling, instrument. So we thought in the world we're imagining, which is this like high knowledge or technology, but kind of elvish people that live in trees, that would be, a mechanism of communication or something, between their little tree kingdoms, I guess.
Yeah, I loved that track. I wrote here, this might be my favorite because I love the malted trumpets, and I'm biased to being a trumpeter, so that made me really happy.
Yeah.
Yeah, big time. So, talk to me a bit more about the collaborative process. I've, many times had on, duos and more, so it's not unusual, but and I think even in almost any other world of music, it's the norm, right? I mean, especially if you look at any kind of pop or hip hop album, I mean, there's just like loads of people working on single tracks, so it's not unusual. But I'm always interested in it because, it does. It just requires you to work with people that you trust, right? So talk to me just about that dynamic and passing tracks around and who starts and how do you decide who starts and stuff like that.
Yeah, I love that question. Feel free to kind of rein me in, but I think, I think that I can start by talking about how this project went, and then maybe touch on some of the aspects of how we're able to create a collaborative culture in a sense of, support and, affirmation in a, sometimes vulnerable and challenging art form. Right. Mm-hmm. So I think in this case, we had an internal process, right? We did have our dear friends at Buck, who we wanted to ensure that we're really happy and felt that the music we were making,
the developer,
was the, it not only was, what they were looking for, but added something to the game and the world and enhanced the entire experience. But in this case, we started with one region, which is called Phlox. This is this desert region of warriors. And I think we had 4 of us, and we sort of collaborated a little bit, but we all took kind of a stab at a really rough pass of like, what could this world sound like? And we're really looking to figure out what the, aesthetic qualities, timbre, all of, kind of musical qualities, what the sort of sense of space, the general mood or tone or vibe or feel would be. And I think we took a few days or a week and, had other things going on at the same time. And then we got back together with the core small team we were working with, and everybody kind of presented their ideas. I think I was actually in the Amsterdam studio there. So I was with 3 of the 4 people, and Spencer was here in the States. And I think we all had, and that's the toughest thing, right? Because everybody's got an idea and they're all good. They all have merits, right? But we wanted to find, well, what's the one, representative path that we think that's the seed of what's going to kind of, help build this world. And then we can pinpoint aspects of the other tracks and compositions that we can think about, adding in or potentially applying to some of the other levels or worlds or, shops, whatever. And so we netted out with a track that Spencer had made that was called Bearded Dragon, which I guess is a desert creature. And it was, I think it's so funny to go back because this is probably September or October of last year. And I mean, I think we all recognized that it had the most promise and it did the best job of honoring the form, right? Like honoring, a roguelike, sort of tile minesweepery game, but bringing some magic to it, right? It was a little bit more harmonically adventurous. There were some, timbres and arrangement decisions that wouldn't be standard in, modern video game music production. But it felt right, it felt like it fit the vibe of the game. So we really took that, and then I think that was the first one, and so everybody kind of piled in, added a ton of stuff. We probably put way too many layers, melodies, instruments, percussion. It was just way too much stuff. And then you look at it and you're like, well, this is typically, depending on what the roll of the dice is, the first levels that you play in the game. Let's scale back and start small. We've got 12 or 15 other, big compositions we can make for this. And so I think then from there, we all came up with ideas. We rallied around one. We all contributed and added what sort of our thoughts or our contributions could be, then had to pare that back, right? And sort of edit and curate what was salient about the piece. And then from there, that kind of became the North Star or the example of what how we were going to approach the other levels. And then from there, we kind of divided and conquered at least that initial phase. So I worked on with one of my colleagues, Pedro, who's my partner that runs the Amsterdam office, the Woodlords, which you'd reference. Charlie, I think she might have single-handedly started with the Saffron. That's the sort of ethereal world, and brought her and Alette, another colleague in Amsterdam. They both sang on those choirs.
Okay.
And then the Capitol was fun because, and maybe that sort of warrants its whole other conversation, because that was sort of the culmination of all of these, and we wanted to play with the trumpet theme. We wanted to have an idea of this sort of like Baroque, it's like the end of their heyday, that they're sort of at this fancy, harpsichordy Baroque ball, but there's, all of these forces that are sort of, infiltrating the Capitol, and that sort of, combined a little bit of everything. But that one, Spencer had started writing. I think we'd kind of hit a wall of like, how is this similar to it, but how is it different? Because there was some, the tempo was much faster. There's a lot more active. We were playing with this sort of Baroque counterpoint thing in a MIDI video game kind of lens. And then so I had taken that over and put on, some harmony and some new melodies. Charlie, she took it and added some thoughts as well. So that one was like and then, Linton had come in and done the trumpet lines and brought, some of that stuff he was outlining, melodies that were already written. And then some stuff he just made up from scratch, especially the chromatic thing, which is one of my favorite aspects of the whole sound. And so anyway, that's a probably long-winded way, but it was very collaborative process where you need somebody to put an idea down, right? Like get it out of your head, onto paper, into a computer, something that people can react to, respond to, add to, subtract from. And then, from there, we're sort of trying to pass the potato around and, allow everybody to have creative contributions. But the tactical aspect of that process is to ensure that we net out with something that feels unified in terms of aesthetic, rather than having 4 different levels that feel like they were totally different composers with a different, toolkit of instruments and whatever. And so that was, that's the process. And then I mean, it's difficult, and we do this in a lot of different ways. We actually just made like a little micro documentary, like a little 7 or 8 minute documentary I'm happy to share with you about how we work and why we do what we do. And it's about a sort of a weird little film we'd made with some visual collaborators last year. But our story is, how do you collaborate in an aspect of creativity that requires so much of your heart and soul. And, I always say, like, the hardest thing about what we do is you really have to put yourself into the work. You have to love it, nurture it, care for it, care about it, for it to be good enough that it's going to resonate with other human beings. And then the challenge is that you also have to be able to step back and allow other ideas to come in, or a client that might not, have the same vision or sensibilities or taste or perspective, wanting to change, and at worst, take out all the things you loved about it, replace them with things you might not, have as much affinity for. We try to work in a process that we don't allow that to happen, or we try to guide, collaboration to make things net better across the board. But as I mentioned earlier, there's so much, vulnerability and ego even. I know that can sometimes be a bad word, and I think it can manifest in bad ways. But I think we can look at, composers and music and also recognize there needs to be an element of ego to get the idea down and out there and in a firm enough format that other people can, understand it and take it in. So I think that's an ongoing, aspect of my professional and artistic life. And I think everybody I work with loves and respects the dichotomy too. But you're kind of always trying to balance a leadership and a supporting role, in terms of composition. And I think what's nice about Antfood and our culture is that we do enough projects that are, we can sort of trade off those roles. And so you can build a community and a culture where, one person is contributing in a certain way on one project, and in another way they're in a different role. And I find, a lot of the people I've worked with for, 15, 10, 13, 8, 7 years. And over that, amount of time, we really, have an understanding of each other as humans and as creatives, and are able to kind of balance and push and pull and, move things to a better way. But it's fun and it's really rewarding, but it also can always be challenging,
So Wilson, when, tell me a little bit about you musically. Like, when did you start playing whatever you played, and what did you play, and all of that?
Sure. Yeah. The joke, I always say I play 1,000 instruments at a very mediocre level, which in my world is better than playing any one virtuosically, including the cuica, as you heard. But I'm not a good cuica player, but I can make it squeak. I think, I always loved music. From when I was a kid, we had a piano in the house. My dad had a guitar that I think I probably took half the strings off and tuned in some open tuning before I knew about anything. I would write little songs, and I'd make mixtapes on a boombox where you're recording it off of the microphone instead of a direct line from the radio to the tape. So I was always interested and obsessed with that. I think my parents got me a guitar for Christmas when I was maybe 12. I played that. I took some piano lessons growing up too, so I had some basis in that. And then I played in a lot of bands. I got into recording with friends in middle school and early high school. We were doing it on 4-track cassette tapes. And then by the time I was sort of, towards the end of high school, there was like early, like the crappiest digital, 4-track Fostex. It was a Zip or a SideQuest drive was the recording medium. And then eventually, getting into early computer recording, some fun, which it all lines up. It's funny. It all lines up with like the aesthetic that we wanted to create for Let's Revolution. But those sound cards, some like early software like Acid Pro and I don't know, Cool Edit. You could do some random stuff, and then. But I mean, and I played in, recreational or like, friends, garage basement playing at the local, community, festival shows and little bars and coffee shops around Philadelphia. But I was also like really interested in recording and music, and I'd studied music theory. I went to college and, studied traditional music. So like theory, composition, Western canon of that world, but with, some emphasis on like the 20th century, also Europeans. And I did, I studied a lot of other stuff. I studied like, Ghanaian music and was pretty diligent in like theory composition and went to study. Is this like too detailed of a personal? Is this
not
good?
At all.
Yeah.
Keep going.
I also, unlike like so many of my friends, I always knew I wanted to work in music. I never had any doubt. And my personal story is very like, whether some of this is true and real and some of this is, artificially created my own narrative. But I do have a very contrarian approach because basically everyone in my life said like music, you can't do that. That's not a thing. That's not a job. Yeah. And my parents were very supportive, and I remember coming home like halfway through freshman year of college and asking, is it like okay if I major in music? And they were like, yeah, it's fine. So, kudos to them, but every other, adult, professional, guidance counselor, teacher, friends even, suggested this was not a path worth, or, that was just feasible to pursue. And so a lot of my story in life is, sort of framed around proving people wrong, at least as it comes to music as a profession. But I was also like very ambitious and driven. So I did that all. I studied, abroad at a conservatory in Prague, and I'd come back to college. And I basically finished my traditional tracked music degree, theory and composition. And I was, friendly with the chair of the music department, who allowed me to start doing a master's in what was called like computer music or multimedia experiences, and it's a lot of stuff that we do today. It was a lot of sort of sort of traditional computer music focus with a practical aspect of Max MSP and processing and some sort of light object-oriented coding for artists. And so I had done that, and then I decided if I like went to New York or LA or Nashville or London, I would end up in some kind of track in production. So I moved, and I'd also studied a different language every year. And so I had sort of fallen in love with Portuguese and Brazilian music and culture. And I like worked for a summer. I saved up $1,000. I moved to Sao Paulo, Brazil, hoping to find a job in either music or motion graphics or animation, which could have been a different path for me. And I signed up to teach English as a second language, like as a backup. But I was fortunate, within a week, I got a gig that was like wrapping cables at a CD DVD recording it was Seu Jorge and Ana Carolina. I don't know if you know them. Seu Jorge is the guy who plays the David Bowie songs in Life Aquatic.
Oh, okay.
He's the good guy in City of God, if you've ever seen that. But anyway, he's a big pop star at the time, still is, I suppose. But the producer of that ran a music house that made largely music for commercials. Paulin, he's still a friend. And so anyway, it's kind of like befriended him. He hired me for this gig. I showed him my work, and then he hired me as a composer. And so then I had started composing for media, a lot of like ads at that time in Brazil. And so I started, my career at sort of a young age, just like writing, music for whatever was coming in. And I always joked that, and I did that, and I bounced around a couple different companies. I worked at the, after that, what I think was the biggest music house in South America at the time, and I had my own room. I met one of my current business partners there, and then went to another place, and eventually ended up in New York. But I always joked that when I was in Brazil, I was like the gringo, I was like the kid who could do good sounding North American and European music. And I moved to New York, and my entire portfolio had a Portuguese voiceover on it. And, like, people would just call me for like salsa, rumba, like Caribbean, Spanish, like, things that had nothing to do with Brazil, nor the actual music that was on my reel, but it was just, So anyway, that's my life story as it pertains to music. Yeah.
Amazing. Oh, that's hilarious. Portuguese, such an amazing. I just interviewed a Portuguese composer. He lives in LA now. Vinicius Barbosa Pipa.
Yeah, I saw that one. I listened to 2 episodes yesterday, and I didn't pick that one, but I'll go back and check it out. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, he was just wonderful, and so we talked a little bit about that, and I've never been down there. I don't know. The music of Brazil is amazing, and the language is so gorgeous. Oh my God, just sing to me in Portuguese anytime. Yeah, I'll do whatever you want.
Let's send you some tracks. Yeah, it's really great if you have a chance. But you too, right? You have a classical and theory background, is that right?
I do, yeah. Mm-hmm. And jazz, yeah. And classical and jazz radio as well, although right now I do news radio. But yeah, so other weird ways to profit from music than, than composing it or performing it. But yeah, I did theory in grad school, and it was hard for me, though. There were things, I have really good ears, so I can like transcribe, certainly not as quickly now as I used to be able to, but that was always real, like transposition, transcription, any of that was easy for me. And so even though theory, I don't have perfect pitch, so it took me a little more work, I still really loved it. I just love that. Yeah. I love it, and we kind of nerd out, but I was listening to one of your episodes the other day, and with Sander, and where you're like, D Dorian, oh, that's interesting, and just think, we get nerdy about these things, and thinking about, there's sort of traditional European assumptions of what, B major, connotes, and I think that I think there's truth in that. And then there's also a lot of flexibility of like, once you go from a traditional European orchestra to some weird synth samples, does it universally read the same way, these, these keys and modalities? But whether or not it's empirically true, we at least like to lean into that as inspiration. Absolutely. It's the best. I love it. And I was going to go somewhere from there. Where was that going to be? This will be an edit. Or maybe not. Who knows? Sometimes I leave it in. Well, I'll get back to it maybe. Well, speaking of theory, I guess this isn't what I was thinking, but this will work. When you talked about the track Bearded Dragon, which on the Spotify playlist is the second one, that's where I first noticed the trumpets. But I know for sure in the first track, and it comes up a few different times, maybe more than what I caught, just some like pentatonic, sequences or whatever. Yeah. I loved that, especially in the first one, the first time it comes in, and it's just like all over the place in like 30-second notes or something. I'm kind of a sucker for the pentatonic scale. So talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, there are a couple of ways to talk about it. I think the least sexy and most honest one is that it's a pretty easy mechanism that you can get to work over a variety of, harmonically adventurous moves.
It's very true.
Especially there's a lot of like Dorian, Mixolydian stuff where we're like, a lot of these things are in G minor, and we're really like often will land, and it'll go through sort of the B flat major, E flat, F, but the real sort of lift is when you get from that G minor to the C major. So I think a lot of the tools that we were using, which were, sometimes early 90s synthesizers, and some were like, our modular, rigs of, more modern Eurorack modules, but that often are, created based on the schematics or inspired by, synthesis from the 70s, 80s, 90s. Often we are using sequencers or arpeggiators to sort of control, these outboard synths, right? I'm sure there's some stuff. It would be disingenuous to say there's no VSTs or digital, plug-in synths in this, but there are very few. Most of the synthesis is actually done, in sort of these 90s authentic things, or some of the more modern tools like the new Dave Smith stuff and some Eurorack stuff that, that approximates that. But that's a long-winded response. But, pentatonic, I think it's something that we can use as a framework and say, okay, just start creating some aleatoric patterns and waves and sequences, but lock it in to these pitches or these control voltages if it's the modular. And that allows us to get a little bit of this kind of unexpected aleatoric, aspects, but still being able to lock into a pretty rigid harmony and time. And so that was, that's across the board. And I think even that last track, which was sort of, kind of meticulously sequenced of this sort of harpsichord thing. I think like Spencer kicked it off. I gave it a little, push and refinement. And then Charlie, she's a classically trained pianist in the Amsterdam studio, really got in and started to think about, okay, how it's not a real harpsichord, but and Bach would never do this chord progression, but what would the sort of voicing and patterns of the arpeggios or ostinatos be in that? So I think there's some stuff that we were actually going in and note by note controlling, and other things where we're really just building a system and then letting it run, and that can be with arpeggiators or sequences, as you mentioned on some of these devices.
Yeah, loved that. Well, shoot. What more do you want to talk about? Oh, the song at the end. We have to talk about the song at the end.
Oh, yeah.
I can't believe I forgot about that for a second there. Tell me about that and who's singing, and it's hilarious. It reminds me of like if Queen, I don't know. I don't even know what it reminds me of, but it's wonderful and fun.
Oh. Well, thank you. That was one of the most fun things, I think, for me. It's actually me singing.
Okay, that's great.
I'm the voice of this, out of touch, despotic king.
Falsetto and all.
Yeah, and it's I actually had to speak like him for 30 minutes recently because we're trying to build a AI voice model, as I mentioned earlier, and so I'm really like assuming this character. I think I'm just going to start talking like him. But that was really fun, and I think it's a little bit of a spoiler. We actually did a live performance of it here the other day, as maybe
cool
fans. And we wanted to do a little video for socials, but I think we're going to hold that a little bit. The game's only been out a week. It seems, I hope it continues to snowball, but it's getting a great response, much more so than we even expected. But it is, I guess I can say this is sort of, it's on the Spotify. We felt like we couldn't not include it on Spotify and the record, but gameplay, you need to fully beat the game as all of the different avatars, and then you get to the credits and you get this song where the king has been captured. He's I guess you got it from the lyrical content, but he's locked in a dungeon at the bottom of his castle or palace, and he's just sort of spouting nonsense about how he's gonna come back and take over, and there's all it's sort of inspired by everyone from Donald Trump to Gargamel from the Smurfs and a billion other characters. But there's like some podcast I was listening to with my kids. I also realized that there's a voice actor in there. But so the idea is that he's like, I'll never give up, I'll never give in, I'm gonna, come back, and like, I'm always the king, I'm gonna be the king. And then, as maybe a classical romantic period music aficionado you might appreciate, we did the whole Berlioz trick, and movement 4 of Symphonie Fantastique, where the guy gets, marched to the scaffold and executed by guillotine. So he's just like, the track just gets bigger and bigger. We bring in the whole rhythm section, and he's really like, going off. And then I guess he just gets, he gets the guillotine. So that's sort of the end of the bonus track of the credits that are there. And I think, we were talking about this. We were sort of went out with some of our friends at Buck the other night, and to celebrate, it was the night of the release. And we were talking, I think there's probably a world where we could have hidden it and somebody found that Easter egg, but I'm sure that there are many game players who, won't listen on Spotify, won't necessarily come across this podcast, and will have the joy of getting to the end and hearing a song through the voice of the king that they've been trying to defeat the whole game.
Amazing. I got a kick out of that. Really fun stuff.
Yeah, that was really fun. Like, just in, it was Michael Hyland, who's the game designer, lead creative director on it. It was a lovely person to work with. He was out to dinner the other night with us, but I think that he and Nick, who's one of the lead devs, kind of said like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we had one of these like Easter egg, songs like at the end? And it was like, just, I don't, it could have been a much busier week for us or something, but it was like one of these little seed ideas that we were like, okay, we've got an idea. And then we were like, yeah, we're thinking of something. And we just like left it like that on the Slack thread with them. And then I think took a couple weeks and like did this whole massive production, and then, brought it back to them. But I think, that those are the things about, these type of projects that are just so fun, where you can, you get the baseline of needs established, and then you can really start to think about, well, what makes this special? What, how do we bring some energy and life and character to this? And also selfishly, it's like, we want to leverage this to do more and more games in different aesthetics and, probably different formats. And, hopefully, it seems like the press and attention and everything is good for that now, because I think collectively where we were is, we were going to some, bigger publishers and saying like, we're whatever, artistically, creatively, infrastructurally, impressive, companies, and we want to make games. And everybody's like, cool, but like, have you shipped anything? So
you have now.
Yeah, so I think, and it's a small and fun game, but I think the goal is, to turn this into more work and more projects. And like, me and my team loves this type of work, and so we're all excited about that. But even within the world of Let's Revolution, initially there were going to be 6 worlds, and we ended up with 4 in this first release. And so we're hoping we can get sort of enough momentum and sort of whatever attention and I guess resources to justify building out those 2 other worlds, which were art directed and sort of concepted. And I'm selfishly just think there's one that I don't want to spoil what they are, I guess, if people are listening, but for us, like, those are great opportunities to take the aesthetic and the approach and think about musically, well, what can we do for an underwater kingdom and a air kingdom? And so I think that we're a team of composers, creatives, project managers, producers who all have diverse backgrounds in music composition, production, but one thing that unites us is we're not stage performers. We're not supporting the next Kanye record or whatever, if he's allowed to make another record. I think and it can be game, it can be film, it can be, physical experience, but we like working on music where it's a part a supporting part, sometimes takes a little leading role in a larger human experience. And that could be linear media or something that's more, experiential. And so I think, and I mean, that's a sort of blowing up the aspect of wanting to make the next two levels of Let's Revolution. But I think the thing that excites me and our team the most is when we can add, to a richer experience rather than just making music for music's sake.
Absolutely. So do you mind telling me the names of the other composers on this project?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to make sure I get everyone right. I know I've got a doc of this, but yeah, so I can also send this to you too if you want.
Oh, okay. Whichever. Yeah.
Yeah, but from our team, the composers were me, Wilson Brown, Pedro Botsaris, Charlie Van Veldehoven, Spencer Casey, and then we had, sound designers was Charlie Spencer, who I'd mentioned, Torin Freeman in Amsterdam, Pedro again, Wilson again, Linton Smith, number 2. He also played the trumpet. Wills Guggenheim, Lawrence Lammers, and Lorenzo Schmidt, he's in our Brazil studio, so we do have Brazil representation. Okay. And then we had all of these other, music production and performance of Bennett Eiferman, Linton Smith played the trumpet, as I mentioned. Rory White played the cellos on a variety of tracks, but notably in the sort of B section of the credits song. Wills Guggenheim, Lucas Baljean, Joshua Heath, Dalton Hartz, and Diana Valero, who is an awesome intern that we have, who's from La Sistema, where like Dudamel came.
Oh, Venezuela.
Yeah, she's cool.
Yeah, because you did. I mean, I don't know that I even mentioned this, but it was more than quote unquote just music. You did all the sound too. Yeah.
Yeah, we did all the sound, and I gave Spencer a shout out too. But he did all of the FMOD wizardry too.
Implementation too. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Full house. Full.
Which was great. And I mean, I think Buck was glad for us to take on that that aspect of it.
Yeah.
But for us, it's better, right? Because we can sort of control the entire approach. There's certain things that are about performance and recording and the way that we're gonna arrange the different musical assets. But we're a very like holistic studio of thinking about that the sum of the parts is greater than anything alone. And so I think having a composer, creative director, and technical lead all be Spencer here in-house, it allowed us to bring a more holistic vision of the score. And we did all of the sound design too. That was a sort of iterative process, and I know you talk to tons of game sound designers and composers, and there's I don't know. I listened to your unpacking one too. I don't think we have 14,000 Foley pieces, but you can look in the repo here. But yeah, I mean, it's a lot of files, a lot of footsteps, and we're very kind of particular about what we wanted to include. I don't even know if this is going to give me a count, but there's a lot. I'm not trying to compete with unpacking, but yeah. So I think that's always one of the most important and underappreciated aspects. And we were sort of doing it in tandem. The sound design, I mean, we were doing that in tandem with the composition. But what we've realized as there were sort of different teams or groups of people working on different parts, there was like, maybe a third of the sounds felt, dead on in the aesthetic of Let's Revolution that we were developing. And then there were other things that felt, appropriate, right? But were more generic or didn't feel bespoke to the kind of world and gameplay that we were working on. So I think a lot of the sort of, weapon, attack gestures, even stuff like footsteps, we have like a Sandy footstep in the phlox desert region, and then we have sort of more of a earthen, crinkly leaves region in the forest. And so I think just paying, attention to those as we got closer to a final build was.
Cool.
My number is 3,234 in terms of audio files. But
yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah.
Well, Wilson, thank you so much for
thanks
chatting with me today. Really tell the team, just really enjoy the music, and just based off of the reviews I read, I think you guys are going to be writing level music for a while on this. I think people are going to want more. So just well done to you and everyone. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thanks so much. I hope some people will play it and enjoy
Definitely.
The music and the gameplay. But I just wanted to say I appreciate you having me so greatly. I've just listened to a couple of yours, but I'm gonna listen to more now, and I just really appreciate that you've carved out a space for talking about the craft and the approach behind game music.